Autumn winds curled through the worn cobblestone streets of downtown Atlanta, weaving their way into every corner of the hospital where Vivian worked. The honey-brown-skinned girl, slim in her silver-gray janitorial uniform, quietly pushed her supply cart down the long, sterile hallway of the emergency wing. Each step was steady, like whispering a silent burden no one else could hear. Vivian never imagined her life would shift course in a single morning. That morning, while cleaning behind the parking lot of Leon Tower, where the hospital contracted weekly sanitation, Vivian suddenly heard a panicked scream. An older man had collapsed beside a sleek black limousine, his trembling hand clutching at his chest, as if desperately trying to hold on to his last breath. Without hesitation, she ran over and caught the falling man. "Sir, can you hear me? Please hang in there. I'm calling for help now," she shouted, while wiping the cold sweat from his brow with a towel. Her hands shook, but she never let go of him, not even for a second. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. But in that brief sliver of time, Vivian had unknowingly set into motion the turning point of her life. Vivian was invited to an unusual meeting in the hospital's grand lobby 3 days later. The man from that day, Mr. Raymond Taylor, honorary chairman of Leon Holdings, sat upright in his wheelchair, sharp eyes studying the young woman with rare contemplation. Beside him stood a tall man in a tailored black suit with a commanding presence, neatly combed dark brown hair and eyes cold as steel. Richard Taylor. "Vivian Yetta," Raymond began, his voice deep and commanding. "You saved my life, and not just my life. You saved this family's future." Vivian bowed slightly, flustered. "I just did what anyone would have done, sir." Richard stood silently beside him. His gaze passed over her, a cold, but not entirely indifferent as glance, though he were observing something both foreign and oddly familiar, something that intrigued him and made him wary all at once. Raymond nodded slightly, then said something that left Vivian speechless. "I want you to marry my grandson, Richard." Silence flooded the room. Vivian nearly laughed, thinking it was some eccentric rich man's joke. But he wasn't joking. "My grandson is pressured to marry in his position on the board of directors. He needs a wife, someone the media won't predict, someone no one would expect. And I believe you're the only one who can keep him from being swallowed whole by this power game." Vivian sprang from her seat. I can't." "Your father," he continued calmly, "needs heart surgery. It's not cheap. I can help." That was the moment Vivian felt her heart sink. She never dreamed of being a billionaire's wife. She only wanted to save the one man left in her life, the father she loved more than herself. She glanced at Richard. His expression hadn't changed, cold, proud, and challenging. But deep in the corner of his eyes, something almost looked sad. Richard said, "We need to make everything legal," his voice low and firm. "After the wedding, I'll be abroad doing business for 3 years. We'll live separate lives. You'll have a bank card. No password needed. When I return, I'll be in touch." Vivian felt like being thrust into a game she'd never learned to play. But between love and sacrifice, she chose her father. 2 weeks later, they signed their names in a discreet marriage registration office. A wedding with no flowers, gown, or smiles. Only quiet glances and the invisible contract hanging between two strangers. The janitor girl with fierce eyes, and the man named Taylor, mysterious as the wind, distant as the moon. Life has twists we never see coming. Don't take your eyes off the fate of Vivian and Richard, because their destiny is only just beginning. If Vivian's decision moved you, don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts below, and follow the channel so you won't miss this story's following emotional and dramatic chapters. 3 years is not long for a busy man, but it can be a lifetime of waiting for someone who lives in silence. Vivian Yetta tucked the slender wedding ring into a small wooden box, placing it at the bottom of a drawer in her low-rent apartment near the train tracks. The ring had never seen sunlight, never had a day to be proudly shown. For Vivian, it was the remnant of a pact, a bond without love or hope, but one that had given new life to the father she loved more than anything. After the wedding day, Richard Taylor left. Not a single letter, phone call, or bank card without a password that lay quietly in her wallet for 3 years. She never once used it. Even when the roof leaked in the rain and she had to work extra night shifts at 2 hospitals, Vivian never touched that money. It wasn't pride. It was because she wanted to live honestly. She was Vivian, not the Taylor family's lady, and indeed, not a shadow of power. Those 3 years, Vivian woke up at 4 a.m. each morning. She cleaned operating rooms at North Atlanta Hospital, then came home to boil water, make soup, and push her father's wheelchair to physical therapy. Her father, Mr. Jeremiah Yetta, had passed the danger zone. He often sat by the window, reading an old Bible and smiling at his daughter, as if he knew she carried the entire sky on her shoulders. "I'm grateful for you, Vivian," he once said, his voice roughened by years of illness. "But what I hope for most is that you don't lose yourself while sacrificing for others." She didn't reply, just gently squeezed his hand. Because sometimes, people can only choose the less painful way to live among painful things. Vivian applied to be a janitor at Leon Enterprises 1 year after the wedding, the corporation that her husband's family owned. No one knew her true identity, and she had no intention of letting anyone find out. That was how she kept her distance. Between her and Richard, Taylor was a marriage stamped in ink, but never existed in life. Here, she was simply Vivian, the quiet night shift cleaner, often called crude nicknames like Trash Girl or Country Bumpkin. Every time she mopped the floors on the 42nd floor, where the CEO's office was, she bowed her head deeply. Not out of fear, but because she didn't want her eyes to accidentally catch the image of a man who had become a cold memory. To co-workers like Laura or Marcus, Vivian was just a stain on Leon Tower's luxurious carpet. A brown-skinned girl from a poor town, riding the bus home at midnight, always silent when mocked. But Vivian wasn't silent out of weakness. She was silent because something deeper resided within her. The quiet of someone who knows they don't need anyone to prove their worth. Spring of the 3rd year. The day Richard Taylor returned was also the day everything began to change. News spread like wildfire. CEO Richard Taylor is back in the country. Just landed from Paris this morning. The board is in a closed meeting. The executive office buzzed louder than on a holiday. Female assistants rushed to reapply lipstick and smooth their hair. Laura, who always mocked Vivian, even sprayed herself with a pungent perfume in front of the mirror. "Don't just stand there like a dummy," Laura snapped when she saw Vivian mopping the hallway. "The floor near Mr. Taylor's office better be spotless. Someone like you screws up even once. Don't be surprised if you get fired." Vivian didn't react. She lowered her head and continued her work, but her heart skipped a beat. Richard is back. 3 years without a single word. A marriage that had never been lit. Now he's returned. What was she to him? A name on a civil registry? A debt of honor? She didn't know, didn't. As Vivian pushed a trash cart down the top floor hallway that afternoon, the glass door slid open. A pair of leather shoes passed at her eye level. A familiar scent. Not sweet, not strong. Just faintly sharp and cold. Brushed by. She looked up. He was there. Richard Taylor. Still him. But the man was no longer a memory. He was flesh and blood. Tall, reserved, his eyes narrowing slightly as they met her face. Vivian? A call as soft as wind. She didn't know if she nodded or just stood frozen. Her heart raced out of rhythm, not because of love, but because 3 years of silence had become an echo too loud to bear. "My office," he said. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be the one assigned to clean there." He turned and walked away, not explaining. Vivian stood there, her heart tightening. She knew another chapter of her life would unfold, a chapter no one else could write for her. And this time, if fate wished to test her again, she would not back down. Vivian Yetta is no longer the girl who left her hometown seeking money to save a life. She was the forgotten wife. And maybe the woman Richard Taylor would have to remember. On the first morning, Vivian cleaned Richard Taylor's office. The room was cloaked in a luxurious silence that felt almost suffocating. The ceiling-high glass window was cracked open slightly, letting pale golden sunlight filter through the blinds and scatter across the polished wooden floor. Everything was immaculate, as if no one had ever lived there. The desk gleamed, the leather chair showed no sign of creases, and the bookshelf stood in perfect order, filled with financial reports in black folders, as cold and rigid as their owner. Vivian set down her cleaning supplies and took a deep breath. Her hand gently moved to wipe the desk's surface, as if caressing an old wound. Her heart echoed with a quiet thud every time the cloth glided across the wood. Every corner of this room carried his presence, the soft scent of mint lingering in the air, the fountain pens precisely aligned on the right corner, the abstract painting he once bought from a street artist in Paris. These small details, she knew, because over the past 3 years, even apart, Vivian had followed him, silently, like someone who borrowed a title, but never stepped into the role. Black coffee, no sugar, 1 cup. Every morning at 9, a flat female voice came from behind her. Vivian turned around. It was Richard's secretary, a tall white woman with her blonde hair tightly coiled up, her face cold like the season's first frost. She continued that he doesn't like anyone disturbing the order in this room, casting a glance over Vivian. And he doesn't like being stared at for too long, especially by people not of his class. Vivian offered a faint smile. "I'm here to clean, not to stare." She bowed her head and went back to work, but the woman's gaze remained like a pin between Vivian's shoulder blades, waiting for the slightest misstep to strike and eliminate. That afternoon, as rain began to fall, Vivian stopped by a small eatery near her home to buy soup for her father. The rain tapped gently on the glass windows, reflecting the warm yellow light inside, making her feel like her heart had settled with the first winter rain. "Vivian?" She turned, startled. It was Miles, her old high school classmate. He used to sit behind her, borrow her notes, and once wrote her a clumsy love letter in his senior year that he never dared to give. "Miles?" Vivian was surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Rideshare driver." He smiled, scratching the back of his head. "Dropped off a client at Leon Tower this morning and saw you. Didn't expect you were still in the city." "Yeah," she said softly. "I work there." Miles looked at her for a moment, and then his expression softened. "You're still the same. Haven't changed at all." Vivian didn't respond. She couldn't tell him she had changed so much, even though she no longer recognized herself. The next morning, Richard entered the office at 9 a.m. sharp, as usual. But today, he paused at the doorway. Vivian was near the window, cleaning the frame with oddly gentle movements. The wind lifted the hem of her shirt slightly, and her neatly tied hair exposed the proud lines of her slender neck. Sunlight streamed in, casting her shadow against the wall. He froze. He didn't understand why, but the scene made his heart miss a beat, a feeling both familiar and distant. "What are you doing here at this hour?" His voice came, low and cold as always. Vivian turned around, unfazed. "I came early today. There were some stains on the window frame I couldn't reach yesterday." Richard remained silent for a moment. His eyes stopped on her hand, long fingers, roughened by cleaning chemicals and winter's cold water. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, his voice slightly lower. Vivian looked him straight in the eye. 2.5 years. Since the first year after you left." A long silence followed. He didn't ask anything else, just lowered his head, walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and pretended to be busy. But the letters on the screen blurred. All he could hear in his mind was, "She stayed. In my company. In my life. And I never knew." As Vivian prepared to leave the building that afternoon, it started raining again. She stood at the steps of the front lobby, pulling her worn coat over her head, stepping out slowly toward the bus stop. A sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down. "Get in." Richard's voice, cold, but laced with unmistakable command. Vivian stood still, rain droplets rolling down her cheeks. She looked at him, then at the car. Part of her wanted to refuse, but another part, tired, soaked, and alone, wanted to sit silently beside him, even if only for a short ride. She got into the car without a word. Richard leaned over and handed her a towel. Their hands brushed, just for a second. Both withdrew. Neither said a word the entire drive. But in that silence, something cracked. A small crack. In the seemingly eternal silence between two people who were once husband and wife. Since that rainy evening, the air between Richard Taylor and Vivian Yetta had grown quiet, but no longer cold. They weren't close, yet not distant. They were like two streams flowing side by side, never touching, but no longer turning away from each other. Every morning, Vivian still came to clean Richard's office as usual, on time, without delay, without unnecessary words. Richard remained silent in front of his computer screen, but sometimes his gaze drifted from numbers and spreadsheets to the figure of the woman wiping the window pane in the morning light. He realized that Vivian was the only one who didn't try to approach him like every other woman around him. She didn't seek his attention, flatter, or try to prove anything. She was silent, as if his presence no longer centered her world. And that, precisely, disoriented him. One late afternoon, after the offices had emptied, Richard walked out of a meeting room with his suit jacket draped over his shoulder, looking worn out. He had just wrapped up a tense negotiation with an investment group from Switzerland. As he passed the janitorial section, he saw Vivian bending to clean the elevator bay. "Vivian!" He called her name for the first time, his voice hoarse and low. She looked up, startled. "Yes? Have dinner with me." 4 simple words, but they tilted her entire world. Vivian looked at him, silent for a few seconds. Why? Richard didn't answer right away. He looked at her, his eyes slightly clouded, as if he wasn't sure of the answer. "We are legally married," he said slowly. "At the very least, dinner wouldn't be too unusual." Vivian nodded gently, not because she expected anything, but deep down, her heart was still a boat once anchored in the harbor of his name. They chose a small restaurant in Midtown, not extravagant, not flashy. The lighting was soft, and the table by the window overlooked a street glowing with holiday lights. Richard ordered a medium-rare steak, and Vivian chose the creamy mushroom soup. "How's your father? How is he doing?" Richard asked after a few minutes of silence. She looked up, surprised he remembered. "He's fine, recovering well after the surgery. I still take him to therapy every week." He nodded slowly. "Back then," he continued, "I didn't think you'd say yes. When my grandfather proposed the marriage, I thought you'd outright refuse. Vivian pressed her lips together. You thought I had a choice? Her words weren't sharp, but they stung. Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. Rain had started to fall lightly. I'm not proud of how I handled it, he admitted. Vivian didn't respond. She just twirled the silver spoon in her hand. The dinner passed in quiet, not unpleasant silence. There were no accusations between them, only things that had never been spoken aloud. That night, when Richard drove her back to the modest apartment on the outskirts of town, he looked at the row of buildings, faintly lit, and couldn't hide his astonishment. You've lived here all these 3 years? He asked, eyes noting the cracks along the gray wall. Vivian nodded. It's enough for me and my father. I don't need more. Richard wanted to say something, but remained silent. As she opened the car door, ready to get out, he called out, Vivian. She turned back. Do you ever regret it? Vivian looked at him for a long time. Yes, she replied, her voice soft like the rain. But not because of the marriage. Because I once believed silence was the only way to keep my heart whole. She closed the door and walked into the night. Richard remained in the quiet cabin of his car, stirred by a strange feeling, like everything he had once overlooked was now returning to knock on his heart. The next morning, Vivian returned to Leon Tower as usual. But that fragile peace was soon torn apart. Laura, one of the senior employees in the planning department, walked into the hallway area with a stack of documents and her usual look of disdain. She had just received news. The position of head of operations was about to open, and the nominee was Vivian. How does a janitor end up on the nomination list? Laura roared, making sure everyone could hear. Unless she has some special relationship with someone on the 42nd floor? Soft sneakers echoed nearby. Vivian stood still, wiped her hands on her cloth, and said nothing. But her eyes gleamed with something that was no longer resignation. That day, as Richard reviewed the market share report, his secretary entered with a tense expression. You need to know this, she said. Rumors are flying all over the company. They say you're backing Vivian for the promotion. Richard put down his pen, his gaze turning cold. Call the entire executive board for a meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow, he said firmly. Vivian must attend as well. What had seemed like an ordinary Monday morning was about to change everything. Because for the first time, Richard Taylor had decided not to stay silent. And Vivian Yetta, the woman known only as the unnamed wife, was about to be brought into the light. No longer just a silent shadow, but a woman strong enough to step forward on her own 2 feet. That morning, the auditorium on the 39th floor of Leon Enterprises was packed. From top-level executives to longtime department heads, everyone was present. The atmosphere was tense like a tightened string. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood the reason for this sudden meeting. The rumor about Vivian Yetta had spread like wildfire. Whispers filled the hallways, the elevators, and even internal messages. A janitor from the countryside, suddenly making it onto the nomination list for a mid-level managerial position? Was it because she had a special relationship with CEO Richard Taylor? Some people came in anticipation of drama, others to see if the cold, calculated CEO was hiding a secret. And Vivian stood silently in the last row. She wore a simple white blouse and black slacks, neatly tied hair, and her eyes were calm. No one knew she had been up all night, standing by the window of her modest apartment, asking herself, is this the moment to step back or step forward? In the end, she chose to show up. Because if life had cast her into the storm, she couldn't keep turning her back to the wind and expect peace. Richard Taylor entered at precisely 9 a.m., like the toll of a bell marking the start. He wore a jet-black suit and dark tie, his eyes sweeping the room with that familiar calm demeanor. But those who watched closely noticed that when his gaze paused at the far end, where Vivian stood still, her face composed, there was a brief softening, like a breeze breaking into stillness. He said, "Thank you all for coming," his voice low and sharp like a blade. "I called this meeting not to justify anything, but to make something clear." The room fell silent. "I am the one who personally submitted Vivian Yetta's name to the nomination list for the operations coordinator position," he stated bluntly, "not because of who she is in my life, but because I believe she is capable." A murmur rose briefly, then died down when his eyes crossed the room. "In the past 2.5 years," he continued, "Vivian has worked at Leon Enterprises as a janitor. She's never asked for a promotion, never complained. But she was the one who handled the emergency on the 42nd floor when the electrical system short-circuited, helping departments manage asset risk before the tech team even arrived." He paused, resting a hand lightly on the table. "She doesn't need anyone to back her. And if anyone in this room still has doubts, I invite you to review her internal records and performance evaluations. But if your doubts stem from something else, then perhaps it's time to question your bias." A heavy silence fell over the hall. Then, a man stood up. Mr. Martin, the head of operations, had over 20 years at the company. "I don't care who someone is outside of work," he said gravelly. "But I've read Ms. Yetta's reports. They're concise, logical, and process-aware. Honestly, many Ivy League grads couldn't write like that." A few others nodded in agreement. Laura, seated near the front, looked stiff and pale. She hadn't expected the narrative to turn so quickly, and she certainly hadn't expected Richard Taylor to boldly take Vivian's side in front of the entire company. After the meeting, Vivian stepped out of the hall, her heart still pounding. She didn't see Richard anywhere. He had left when the meeting ended, as if leaving behind only a cold thunderclap that shook every corner of the building. Just as she reached the elevator, Richard's assistant approached. "Director Taylor would like to see you in his office," she said flatly, emotionless. Vivian nodded, walking through the lingering stairs, curious, cautious. The office door closed behind her. Richard stood by the window, the afternoon sun shining on his dark hair and angular features. "You asked to see me because," she said. "Because I want to know." He turned, eyes meeting hers. "If you're ready to step out of my shadow." Vivian froze. "For 3 years, you avoided the spotlight, thinking you were just someone on the sidelines," he continued. "But this morning, when you stood in that room, not bowing, not trembling, I knew you weren't the same girl from before." Vivian took a deep breath. "Richard," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I don't need your protection. I need your belief. If I'm going to rise, it has to be because I deserve it, not because I legally carry the Taylor name." He looked at her, silent for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Then prove it," he said. "Over the next 30 days, I'll give you access to an internal project for planning, execution, and final reporting. If you succeed, the operations coordinator position is yours." Vivian met his gaze, eyes unwavering. "Agreed," she replied. There were no walls, silence, or awkward distance between them for the first time. Just two people, two wills, and a pact, not built on title, but on talent and pride. And from that moment on, among the hundreds within Leon Tower, Richard Taylor's gaze rested on one woman alone, the woman he once forgot. Now, he was looking again, with all the seriousness and quiet fear of a man beginning to realize he might lose something precious once more. 30 days. A span long enough for a rumor to sweep through the building. yet far too short for someone from the janitorial team to be seen as a qualified operations coordinator, at least in the eyes of those who measured a person's worth by their resume. Vivian Yetta understood that, but she did not back down. Her entire routine was upended from the day Richard Taylor handed her the trial project. Instead of quietly cleaning the hallways at night, she was now in charge of the Athena plan, a strategic initiative to restructure internal logistics for all Eastern Branch offices of Leon Enterprises. A major project, risky, full of traps. No one believed she could pull it off. But Richard said nothing more. He gave her a small side office on the 25th floor, a company email account, and one short directive: do it your way. No one knew that each night, as the lights in the towers dimmed one by one, Vivian's tiny office remained lit. She pored over technical documents, taught herself logistics models, and looked up terms she'd never heard of 3 years ago. She studied like someone racing against time, devouring every line as if it were a debt long overdue. Her father, Mr. Jeremiah, would sometimes sit on the old sofa, watching his daughter work late into the night. He said one evening that my girl is no longer someone who needs anyone to lead her. Vivian smiled, eyes misty, but she kept drawing process diagrams without pause. The first meeting for Project Athena took place in the second week. The main conference room on the 22nd floor was packed. Tech team leads, logistics reps, HR, and the finance department. And of course, Laura. She sat directly across from Vivian, wearing an expensive blazer, eyes gleaming with challenge. Richard Taylor wasn't present, but his assistant was. That made every gaze turn to Vivian, the woman they still couldn't quite categorize as belonging to whom. "I've reviewed your analysis." Ms. Yetta, a finance staffer, spoke up. "But you're relying heavily on theoretical benchmarks without considering the real-world risks at our branch locations." His tone was polite, but loaded. Vivian nodded and pulled up the report on the big screen. "You're right, because I want direct feedback from each department," she replied calmly. "I'm not here to prove I'm right. I'm here to listen before I decide." A few glances were exchanged. The room tension eased slightly. Laura smirked. "How touching. But let's not forget, this is a company, not a class on life values." Vivian turned toward her, face unchanged. She said Ms. Laura's voice was as soft as rain but firm. "And precisely because this was a company, I couldn't make decisions based on assumptions or emotion." For the first time, Laura fell silent. Something unusual happened by the third week, as specialized teams began assigning support staff to Vivian's project. The people who once saw her as the janitor, who could make spreadsheets, were now listening to her explain optimal distribution mechanisms. She didn't use flashy jargon. She spoke directly and to the point. In every meeting, she brought a cup of black tea. It was what kept her focused, what kept her grounded amid the doubts. Richard once asked, "Why not drink coffee like everyone else?" And she only smiled. "Because tea takes time to steep like trust." Richard began watching her more closely, not through words of encouragement, but in ways only a man would. Arriving early to meetings to see her notes, quietly listening to her presentations without interruption. He didn't interfere, but his eyes followed her, patient and thoughtful. One Friday afternoon, as Vivian prepared to leave the office, heavy rain poured outside. She entered the lobby, her thin coat no match for the biting wind slashing across her shoulders. Richard waited under the glass awning, holding a black umbrella. "Let's go," he said, not meeting her eyes. Vivian hesitated. "Home?" "No," he answered. "There's somewhere I want to take you." The car glided past streets glowing with light, turned onto a tree-lined road, and stopped in front of a rustic wooden house, not large, not luxurious, but warm. "What is this place?" she asked as they stepped inside. My mother's old house, he said, his eyes distant. She passed when I was 16. I kept this place because I never dared to come back. Vivian looked around. Old paintings lined the walls. The fireplace was covered in dust, but a faint scent of cinnamon lingered. Why today? She asked. Because I remembered something my mother once said. If one day you meet a woman who can make you quiet enough to listen, don't let her go. He turned to her. And I think, I'm listening to you now. Vivian didn't respond, but in her eyes, for the first time, something broke open. Not anger, not defense, but a softness long buried. That night, they didn't talk much. They dusted off an old table together, lit the fireplace, and sat side by side like two strangers who once knew each other deeply. Vivian poured him a cup of black tea. Tea's not as bitter as I thought, Richard said with a faint smile. That's because you haven't reached the bottom. She tilted her head, and he realized the woman before him was no longer the girl who agreed to marry him out of family debt. She was a woman who had learned to turn silence into strength, little by little. There was no confession between them. But something quietly shifted that night in the old house, steeped in memory. Not the birth of love, but the first cracks in the ice that had long separated them were finally beginning to melt. The final week of the Athena project trial phase opened with tension as taut as a drawn string. All specialized teams had submitted their sub-reports, but only Vivian remained responsible for compiling and presenting the full proposal to the board. Silence was no longer her shield, but a kind of presence that made those who once doubted her grow cautious. Laura no longer attacked her publicly, but the glances, the whispers behind her back, hadn't stopped. Vivian knew well, success doesn't make people like you more. It only makes them wary, and sometimes quietly wish you'd fail. Monday. The Athena presentation was held in the central boardroom on the 40th floor, a space reserved only for strategic meetings. No one in the company could ignore this event, partly because the project directly affected the company's operations, but more so, because the person presenting was Vivian Yetta. The woman who once bowed her head to mop the floors now stood among those who'd long walked the red carpets of corporate power. She wore a navy blue suit, tailored and unflashy, but full of confidence and composure. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, revealing a slender face with an almost unnerving calm. Nothing but a report and a clicker for the projector screen were in her hands. Richard Taylor sat in the front row of the board seats, his eyes never leaving her from start to finish. But he didn't interfere or comment. He let her walk alone, just as he'd promised. Vivian's presentation was concise and precise. She didn't flaunt her knowledge, didn't list hardships. Instead, she posed the problem. Operating costs had risen 18% over the past 2 years. Distribution efficiency had dropped, and delivery times in some eastern branches had stretched to 30 hours. Then she offered her solution. We don't need to lay off staff. We need to restructure the process flow, turning redundant steps into a streamlined path with smart checkpoints between each logistics layer. A new model diagram appeared. The room stayed silent. The first to nod was Mr. Martin. Then the logistics lead. A few people began taking notes. Vivian lifted her gaze, calm. She said implementation costs will increase by 4.6% in the first 3 months. However, after month 4, the system will self-correct and save 9.2% in quarterly operating expenses. A perfect word was heard from the board's side. The meeting ended after an hour and a half, succinct and compelling. Vivian stayed behind to pack up the projector as others filtered out. Her hands remained steady, until someone whispered behind her, "Not bad. But don't forget, your position didn't come from competence. It came from your status." Vivian turned. It was Laura, eyes sharp as a blade freshly honed. Vivian responded with a thin smile. "And you should remember," she said gently, "only those lacking ability need to cling to someone else's status to justify their failure." That afternoon, as Richard walked into her office, he found Vivian bandaging her finger, a small cut on her right hand. She'd scraped it against a broken glass edge while putting the projector away. "Let me see," he said, stepping closer. Vivian started to decline, but Richard gently took her hand. "That's a deep one," he said quietly. "Do you need stitches?" "No," she replied, "just a scratch." He didn't argue. He grabbed the first aid kit from the shelf, washed the wound carefully, and bandaged it. His hands were clumsy, but gentle. His fingers against her skin, warm and real. "I used to think," Richard said while placing the last bandage, "you'd never forgive me." Vivian looked down at her hand, then said softly, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means I no longer want the past to hold me back." He was silent for a while, then held her hand again, this time not to bandage it. "Can I walk beside you from now on?" His voice was low, but it had clarity, unlike before. Vivian looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were no longer distant, but not yet fully trusting. "Walk beside me," she murmured. "But don't walk ahead, and don't walk behind. We need to learn how to walk together like two grown adults." Richard nodded. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a door opening. A door out of a rugged past, into something more honest and deserving. That night, when Vivian returned home, her father was sitting by the window, the soft yellow nightlight casting his shadow on the wall. "My daughter sat with the whole board today, didn't she?" he said with a teasing smile. Vivian sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder like she used to when she was a little girl. "I didn't beat anyone," she whispered, "but I didn't lose to myself." He placed a hand on her hair and gave it a gentle pat. "That's enough, Vivian." She closed her eyes. There was no longer the noise of insults or doubt in her heart, only the sound of her footsteps, clear, steady, walking forward, with a man who was learning to love her, not through grand gestures or words, but through gentle touches, quiet glances, and a silence no longer born of fear. A small cut, when appropriately dressed, will heal, just like the heart of a woman who had once been forgotten. The success of the Athena project spread through the company's hallways like freshly steeped tea, not sharp, not sweet, but strong enough that no one could ignore it. From someone once considered a mistake in the personnel file, Vivian was now mentioned in team meetings, internal emails, and hallway conversations, with a changed tone, half admiring, half wary. She was no longer just the cleaning girl from the 42nd floor. She was behind the revival of a logistics system falling apart. Yet power in a corporation is like water beneath ice. When one layer melts, the current starts to move. And not everyone wanted Vivian to succeed. On Tuesday, Richard attended an investment summit in New York, temporarily leaving internal oversight to the executive board. Vivian returned to her usual rhythm and reviewed Athena's handoff process with the operations management team. That afternoon, she received an anonymous email with a simple message. "Check the internal account of the Savannah branch. There's something that'll cure your delusions." She frowned, but didn't panic. With the caution of someone who had once lived at rock bottom, Vivian had learned never to underestimate any signal, no matter how faint. She accessed the system. After a few preliminary checks, her vision darkened. Several orders had been unusually split, costs were overwritten, and most importantly, Evidence showed that someone in the logistics department had used Athena's name to approve smuggled goods. She immediately locked system access, printed transaction logs, and sent all documents to the internal audit department. But within the hour, the information was leaked. The next morning, headlines blared across online news outlets. Leon's new coordinator under internal misappropriation scandal. The name Vivian appeared boldly, like a question mark dropped into a sea of curious eyes. Laura entered the temporary boardroom and placed the newspaper on the table. I said it from the beginning. She's not clean enough to handle a regional-level project. Vivian sat across from her, gaze steady and unshaken. She knew this wasn't just an incident. It was a counterstrike, and the ones behind it weren't working alone. Do you have anything to say? A member of the audit board asked. Vivian presented the system report with a verified timestamp from the day before, the log showing she had locked access, and the anonymous email. I was the one who discovered the issue, she stated clearly, and I was the first to report it. Whoever is behind this isn't just trying to sabotage Athena. They're trying to taint every legitimate effort in this company. Laura let out a soft chuckle. How cute. Blaming invisible enemies is the oldest defense trick in the business world. Vivian didn't respond. She gathered her documents and left the room. That night, at the old wooden house, where Richard had once taken her, the warm yellow light was still on when the familiar black car pulled up. He stepped out, dark trench coat soaked with rain, his expression like cold steel. She opened the door when he knocked. No need for small talk. Richard pulled a copy of the article from his coat pocket and laid it on the table. I've read it, he said, his voice low but not angry. And I know you had nothing to do with it. Vivian poured him a cup of hot tea. No sugar. Where does that trust come from? She asked, eyes looking out at the rain-splattered window. Because I've learned. You don't prove yourself with words, he said. You prove it with actions. He moved closer, close enough for her to feel his breath grazing her hair. And because I know, he continued softly, if I were falsely accused today, you wouldn't walk away either. Vivian turned her face, locking eyes with him, deep, stormy, unresolved. She said nothing, just leaned in, and the kiss came as naturally as breathing, not fiery, not forced, just lips meeting lips, long enough to wash away anger, fear, and exhaustion in that fleeting moment. A kiss between two people who had once been married, now without titles, but full of meaning. A silent acknowledgement that although the past had once been a blade, the present could be the stitch, a fragile thread, yet strong enough to mend silent fractures. That night, they didn't talk business. They just sat by the fireplace, in silence. She told him about her first night stepping into Leon, with a trembling janitor's badge in hand. He told her about his first time standing before the board of directors after taking over as CEO, with polished shoes, but a heart that shook like a lost child's. They laughed, then fell quiet. But in that silence, an unspoken pact was formed. No words were exchanged, but both understood. If the outside world still wanted to push Vivian out of the orbit of success, she was no longer alone this time. And Richard, the man who once abandoned her in silence, now stood beside her, not by title, but with a heart that had learned to listen and protect. The next morning, as Vivian walked into her office, there was a small bouquet at her door. Nothing flashy, just a few sprigs of purple aster and a note. Don't let anyone rewrite your story. You are the one holding the pen. R. Vivian smiled, not because of the flowers, but because, at last, she was strong enough to step out of someone else's narrative and begin a new chapter, on her terms. A week after the scandal was quelled by an internal investigation report that cleared Vivian, the atmosphere at Leon Enterprises seemed to return to its regular orbit. But Vivian knew this quiet was not peace. It was only temporary. In the corporate world, every round of applause carries a question mark, and every handshake might conceal a blade. Still, for the first time in 3 years since her secret marriage to Richard Taylor, Vivian felt herself moving forward without being held back by old shadows. She was beginning to be invited to senior-level meetings. Her name was added to the company's long-term strategic candidate list. Yet amidst all these changes, one thing left her more unsettled than the rest. Her relationship with Richard was shifting in hue, no longer black and white. That evening, Vivian stood before her closet in her small apartment, fingers brushing past several monochrome dresses. Richard had just texted, "Come with me tonight. No parties, no ceremony, just a necessary evening." She chose a plum-colored bateau neck dress, refined yet straightforward, soft and rigid. The face reflected in the mirror was still Vivian, but the version who had learned to keep her back straight even when the world tilted. Richard's car pulled up at 7 p.m. He didn't say much, just opened the car door for her, like a man who had learned when to be silent. The location that evening wasn't a fancy restaurant or an investment summit. It was a cozy space on the top floor of an art library, a place Richard visited with his mother on her birthdays before she passed away. The small room, with a glass ceiling that opened to the Atlanta night sky, had only one table set for two. Outside was a balcony wrapped in greenery, lights twinkling softly like morning dew on pine branches. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of aged wood and warm tea. Richard said that things between them remain unclear as he pulled out her chair. "And I don't intend to turn tonight into some emotional performance. I want us to sit like two people with the right to speak honestly." Vivian sat down, not avoiding his gaze. "Then speak," she replied. "I'm listening." Dinner passed quietly, without drama. Just stories woven between past and present. Richard spoke about his years in Paris, where he had run away from himself after agreeing to a loveless marriage out of obligation. He didn't justify, didn't apologize. He told it. Honest. Bare. Vivian listened, swirling her wine glass. Many layers of emotions rose within her. Anger, sympathy, regret. But above all, it was a strange calm, like touching an old scar that no longer hurts. "You were always good at forgetting," Vivian said after a pause. "But I never knew how to forget." Richard stayed silent. "There were nights," she continued, "when I wondered if I had ever truly existed in your memory, or if I was just another name erased among a sea of hollow relationships." He said quietly that "You're the one thing I didn't dare think about, because every time I did, I saw how much of a coward I was." That made her turn away. A breeze brushed her collar, and old memories surged like a wave. A nod in a silent wedding hall. A cold bank card. A man who vanished before the marriage even drew its first breath. "What do you want from me, Richard?" she asked, eyes looking out into the distance. Another chance? Forgiveness? Or just comfort for your guilt? Richard stood, stepped onto the balcony, then turned back, voice husky. "I want you to know, this time, if you choose to stay, it won't be because of any debt. It'll be because I've become someone worthy." Vivian froze. Not because the words were unfamiliar, but, for the first time, Richard Taylor, the seemingly untouchable man, was placing himself in a position where he had to prove himself, not with wealth, not with power, but with the courage to love someone he had once abandoned. They left the library near midnight. On the drive home, Vivian sat silently, head resting against the window, eyes quietly watching the streetlights blur into glowing trails. Richard opened the door without a word when the car stopped in front of her apartment. Vivian stepped out and stood at her doorstep. Then, just before closing the wooden door, she turned. "Richard." He looked up. She said softly that if you want to walk beside me, don't just show up in romantic moments. Please show up when I'm at my worst, when I'm weak, when there's nothing lovable left to hold on to. Richard nodded, not smiling. She closed the door. And in her heart, there was no thunderclap, no swelling music, just a steady beat. Like someone who had once gone numb from pain, was learning to believe in small kindnesses again. A new folder was on her desk, under the soft glow of her bedside lamp. The successor to the Athena project, a more formidable, harsher challenge. But this time, Vivian wouldn't be fighting alone. And sometimes, in life, all a person needs isn't a lifetime promise, but the right presence, at the right time, from the right person. Even if the heart doesn't yet know what to call that feeling. Winter morning sunlight slanted through the glass windows on the 25th floor, casting a pale golden hue over Vivian Yetta's office, like the color of dried straw. At first glance, the room looked unchanged. The same gray-toned chairs, the shelves packed with thick files, and a vase of purple aster flowers with fresh water, replaced each morning. But only Vivian knew. Everything in this space was shifting, not because of the furnishings, but because she was no longer the woman who had first stepped into this room with the mindset of someone borrowing a chance. Now, she was being entrusted with a bigger challenge. Project Horizon. An initiative to integrate supply chain data between Leon Enterprises and its international partners required expertise, a sharp sensitivity to internal politics, and a global strategic vision. And just then, Richard Taylor decided to do something that sent ripples through the entire system. He publicly revealed Vivian as his wife at the company's annual shareholders conference. The announcement was made calmly, as if it were no big deal. "As CEO, I need to be transparent with shareholders about changes in my records," he said, eyes steady on the rows of dark mahogany leather chairs. "I'm married. My spouse is Vivian Yetta, the current lead of Project Horizon." A wave of murmurs surged like a dam breaking. No one expected it. No one was prepared. No one believed this connection, once thought a rumor, a temporary manipulation, would be acknowledged so plainly. Sitting in the back row among regional representatives, Vivian felt each heartbeat pounding against her chest wall. She hadn't been warned, and she hadn't been asked for consent. After the meeting, she went straight to her office, removed her blazer, and poured herself a cold water. Not because she was thirsty, but to keep her mind from heating up under the chaos that had just been unleashed. A knock on the door. Richard entered unhurriedly. In his hand was a phone with the ringer turned off. "I should have asked you first," he said. "You should have stayed silent," she replied, not angry, but not gentle either. They looked at each other. In both their eyes, countless things remained unspoken. Richard stepped closer, leaning slightly against her desk. His voice deepened. "I didn't do it to claim ownership. I did it to disarm those who want to use the past to hurt you." "And you think?" Vivian slowly stood up. "Just because I earned my position, people will stop seeing me as the woman who was lifted because she bears the name Taylor?" "No," he replied. "I think, no matter what you do, they'll still talk. So instead of letting them whisper in the dark, I wanted them to speak openly, in front of you, on equal footing." Vivian sat back down, her gaze no longer tense, but profoundly still. "I don't need to be protected like a flag. I want to be trusted like an ordinary person." Richard didn't respond right away, but he moved closer and placed an old photo in front of her, a picture of them taken at their quiet marriage registration 3 years ago. She, in a gray sweater, had her hair neatly tied. He was in a black suit with emotionless eyes. I used to think this was the biggest mistake of my life, he said quietly. But now I realize the mistake wasn't marrying you. It was keeping you in a marriage with no light. Vivian said nothing. She looked at the photo, as if meeting an old version of herself, the woman who had endured more than anyone could imagine. That afternoon, Vivian walked down to the technical department, where diagrams, blueprints, and code charts for Project Horizon were being reviewed. She wasn't there to inspect. She was there to listen. A young engineer named Kieran showed her the data flow diagram, pointing out a bottleneck causing delays between the payment and logistics systems. He said we need access to a higher data tier to reroute the flow. But security hasn't granted it yet. Vivian nodded, noting it down. I'll coordinate with that department. But remember, security isn't just a wall. It keeps trust from being stolen. Kieran looked at her momentarily, then said softly, I was an intern when you were still on janitorial duty. You once showed me how to recycle trash without spilling dirty water in the hallway. Vivian was surprised. He smiled. I remember because you said, cleaning isn't a small matter. It's how I show respect for the space others will walk into after me. She smiled, so gently it was barely visible. That night, Vivian came home. The apartment was as quiet as always. Only the ticking of the wall clock broke the silence. She took off her shoes, walked to the dining table, and found a small box placed neatly on it. No card, no ribbon. She opened it. Inside was a black fountain pen with a silver barrel engraved. Write your story on your terms. No need to guess who sent it. Vivian picked up the pen, her expression calm. Not emotional, not overly moved. Just a quiet grace, like someone who no longer needs a path carved for her, but still doesn't refuse a hand offered at the right moment. The next morning, as she entered Leon's headquarters, the receptionist smiled and whispered, Ms. Vivian and Mr. Taylor updated the system records. You're now fully listed with your title and leadership role on the Horizon project, not just as an associate lead. Vivian nodded, asking nothing more. But within her, something had realigned, not from the outside, but from within. She was no longer the nameless woman walking down forgotten corridors. She was Vivian Yetta, the woman who once silently kept the company clean and who now was helping to reshape it. And if those walls could talk, they would surely tell the story of a woman who once quietly scrubbed every tiny stain. In preparation for the day, she would become an indispensable part of the place she once walked through unseen. It rained in Atlanta for 3 straight days. Rains that weren't heavy but unrelenting, as if the sky was mulling over something it wasn't quite ready to say. The streets glistened with water. The glass walls of high-rises were veiled in thin fog, and in the gray-washed atmosphere, Leon Enterprises remained lit floor by floor, like a silent fortress amidst the city's bustle. Vivian Yetta kept working as usual, but something inside her had begun to ripen. Not a sudden transformation, but a quiet accumulation of trust earned day by day, of projects completed, of gazes slowly shifting from suspicion to respect. Yet the closer something moves toward the light, the longer the shadow behind it stretches. On Wednesday afternoon, Vivian stumbled across something odd while reviewing new supplier proposals for Horizon. A potential partner named EnvoSync Inc., proposed by the Western Regional Operations Division, had financial statements that were too pristine, almost unrealistically ideal. There are no errors, no debts, and no fluctuating profit line over 3 years. Vivian didn't believe in perfection. She requested that the internal audit team conduct a deeper investigation, and a few hours later, an internal memo marked confidential appeared on her screen. EnvoSync is a shell subsidiary of an organization previously involved in money laundering through African front companies. The sender was a familiar name, Charles Dunn, senior legal counsel, known for his loyalty to Leon and one of the system's most tight-lipped individuals. Vivian immediately requested that the proposal be withdrawn, revoked EnvoSync's system access, and informed Richard of the situation. That evening, Richard arrived at her office just as the clock struck 9. He wore a long overcoat, his face slightly pale from the cold, but in his eyes, more evident than worry, was fury. "You did the right thing," he began, "but do you know who you just tangled with?" Vivian's expression didn't change. "Who put EnvoSync forward? The Western Division Executive Vice President is nominated as next year's COO, and he holds hidden shares in EnvoSync. But there's not enough hard evidence yet. If we bring this up now, the entire board will tear the case apart before we can prove anything." Vivian stood and walked to the window. Rain was still falling, small droplets pattering against the glass. Below, car lights flickered red and yellow as they glided through a different world. "You want me to stay silent?" she asked, not harshly, but without softness. Richard stepped closer, his voice lowered. "I want you to be careful." The next morning, Leon's internal news platform unexpectedly posted, "Horizon Project halts Western Division rollout over supplier concerns." No one knew the exact source of the leak, but whispers spread that Vivian Yetta was behind the move. For the first time, her name appeared alongside the phrase internal leak. During this, Vivian received an unexpected call from Charles Dunn. His voice was low and cautious. "You should meet me. Some things can't be sent over email." The meeting occurred in the evening, at a hidden cafe tucked into a back alley on the city's south side. When Vivian arrived, Charles was seated, his hand resting on a weathered brown leather bag. "EnvoSync is just the surface," he said. "Over the past 3 years, several other suppliers have been covertly contracted with Leon. And more troubling, some of those contracts appear to be signed under the name of the Strategic Department, the very one you work in." Vivian froze. "You're saying someone's impersonating me?" Charles nodded. "Or impersonating your department and fabricating internal documents to clean financial flows. And someone doesn't want you climbing too high, because the more you see, the more dangerous you become." Vivian felt her fingertips turn cold. She wasn't afraid for herself. She feared for the truth, the thing she had tried to protect since her first day at Leon. When she left the cafe, the rain had stopped, but the ground remained wet. Streetlights shimmered across the sidewalk in mottled pools of reflection, like secrets surfacing from the pavement. And amidst that setting, Vivian saw one thing clearly. She could no longer do her part and turn away. She had become a link in a bigger game, where trust wasn't enough, and loyalty could be a double-edged blade. That night, she sat at her desk, opening file after file, data folder after folder. Her eyes were no longer tired, but lit with a quiet, burning fire. This was no longer about a project, no longer about a career. It was about honor. The honor of someone once viewed as a mere attachment to a powerful man's life, who now chose to rise and confront a flawed system. From this moment forward, she knew there was no returning to the old Vivian. She was stepping into the arena of those who understood. Sometimes, to keep a company clean, one must be willing to wade through its very mud. And whether Richard stood beside her or not, Vivian was ready. Not to confront, but to face it. One Monday morning, the sky over Atlanta wore a silent gray, as if the entire city held its breath before something was about to break free. Inside Vivian Yetta's office on the 25th floor of Leon Enterprises, the warm yellow light gently illuminated her desk, where documents marked with sticky notes of every color spread like the map of a silent battle. She had spent the whole weekend retracing every contract line, every timeline, every signature. And now, before her was undeniable data. At least 4 multi-million-dollar contracts had been signed through the strategic department during the 3 months she was on leave caring for her father. Signed? Not by her. But the authentication system recorded the electronic fingerprint as Vivian's. She leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced before her mouth, eyes darkening like a sky just clouded over. When Richard entered, she remained silent as before. He watched her for a few seconds before speaking. "I heard." Vivian didn't turn around. "Heard what?" "That someone is fabricating evidence to frame you." She gave a faint smile. "Not just someone. An entire machine." Richard pulled out his phone and placed it in front of her. A magnified image from the internal security system showing a senior IT staff member illegally accessing biometric authentication records, dated May 17th, the same day the EnvoSync file was stamped approved. "This is part of a plan," he said. "They want to make you the weak link to break the restructuring strategy you're coordinating." "And what will you do?" she asked, eyes still on the documents. Richard was silent. He wasn't a man easily cornered, but he understood that what Vivian needed now wasn't protection from him. It was an action matching the responsibility. "I called an emergency meeting with the internal control board, and they replied after a few seconds. But before that, I want to hear from you." Vivian looked up at him. "Do you trust me?" Her voice was as soft as wind brushing a lake's surface. Richard didn't answer right away, but his eyes, full of layered emotions, spoke what words couldn't express. "I don't just trust you," he finally said. "I trust how you see the world, so I can no longer remain silent." The internal meeting occurred that afternoon in a glass room, surrounded by gray curtains that dimmed the light. Seasoned faces sat around the table, each with their expression: cold, skeptical, guarded. Vivian was invited to present first. She stood, slowly scanning each person. There was no sign of someone merely defending themselves. She was a strategist, placing her pieces. "I'm not here to ask for trust. I'm here to remind you that if Leon's internal controls allow an individual to falsify biometric data and authorize millions of dollars, then the problem isn't me. It's your structure." She presented the file, pointing out every vulnerability, every moment susceptible to manipulation, concluding, "If you want to deal with me, deal with the system that enabled the person behind me to exist." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Charles Dunn, sitting at the back, nodded quietly. "I propose suspending those responsible for biometric data during the suspicious period and forming an independent audit committee to investigate." Another director immediately responded, "And in the meantime, who coordinates Horizon?" All eyes turned back to Vivian. She knew this moment was a boundary, either moving forward or being pushed back forever. "I will continue the project," she said calmly, "but I request direct access to the authentication system. If I can be forged, then any of you could be next." The silence erupted into quiet consensus. The board did not applaud, but no one opposed. Vivian stood by the window in her quiet office that night, watching the rain fall. Water droplets traced long paths down the glass like whispers of the past. Times she was underestimated and excluded from meetings for being unsuitable. The door behind her opened. Richard entered, but this time he carried no files or charts, just a worn, dark brown leather notebook, frayed at the corners. "My mother's," he said, placing it in her hands. She once wrote, "What makes a woman invincible isn't coldness, but the perseverance forged through every failure she refuses to succumb to." Vivian looked at the first page. Soft, slanted, careful handwriting. She didn't know why he gave it to her now, but she felt this. In a world where trust is challenged daily, that quiet hand passing was a form of love more profound than any declaration. That night, Vivian didn't sleep. She sat at her desk, flipping through the notebook pages, a gentle storm inside her. Not violent, but enough for her to understand. From this moment forward, she no longer represented only herself. She represented all those once seen as outsiders, women who silently kept the organization running in the shadows, only to be forgotten when the light shone through. But now, Vivian was no longer on the sidelines. She was at the center, and she was ready, not just to fight hidden forces, but to step forward as someone rewriting the rules, on the boundaries of trust she had never betrayed. The city after rain often carries a distinct scent, a mixture of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the warm breath of dreams not yet formed. That day, Atlanta wore a misty veil, where everything seemed hidden beneath a thin silk layer. Yet it was within that haze that secrets began to surface. Vivian Yetta was no longer the silent woman cleaning up others' mistakes. She was becoming the rulemaker, rewriting what had once been overlooked. The Horizon Project, though still scrutinized through many suspicious lenses, had begun to shift. Data from central zones was cleaned, and supply chains were reorganized. Engineers who had once kept their distance from Vivian now proactively sought her advice and reported issues. But amid this progress, Vivian sensed something amiss, as if everything was moving too smoothly after a massive storm. Then came a warning from the last place she expected. The protector, Darius, was the night's security guard on the 25th floor, who habitually read philosophy books in his security booth and always greeted her with a polite smile. That evening, as she left the office late, he quietly said, "Ms. Yetta, there's something I think you should know." She turned, tilting her head slightly. "I saw someone break into the B3 technical area at 3 a.m. last night. The internal camera system malfunctioned for 8 minutes. Not a coincidence." Vivian narrowed her eyes. "Did you report it?" "Yes," Darius replied. "But then I was ordered not to mention it again." She was silent momentarily, then quietly said, "Can you show me the system event log?" Darius nodded. Within 15 minutes, a data file was sent to her. What Vivian discovered chilled her to the bone. Someone had used a high-level security card to back up all Horizon's test data and transferred it to an unregistered device, right when she presented the remediation plan to the oversight board. In other words, while she stood in the spotlight, someone silently stole the heart of the project. The very next morning, Vivian requested a private meeting with Richard Taylor. Looking weary, he sat in his office, but his eyes instantly sharpened as she explained. "Do you think it's an inside spy?" he asked. Vivian nodded. "Not just a spy. Someone with enough clearance to access high-level areas and smart enough to cover their tracks. I don't rule out the possibility that a senior board member is involved." Richard stood and walked to the window. The room fell silent. Then he turned back, whispering, "There's a name I once suspected, and now I hope I'm wrong." Vivian didn't ask who. She knew if Richard wasn't ready to say it, it meant the person was close, familiar, and dangerous. A day later, the internal Leon Bulletin suddenly reported that original copies of Horizon data had been lost. Official internal investigation launched. Rumors stirred again. Some suspected it was Vivian's plot to manipulate the project. Others stayed silent, knowing that many masks would be torn off if this went all the way. Charles Dunn called her at midnight. "They want you to admit management failure. If you sign a limited liability commitment, they won't investigate further." Vivian closed her eyes, silent for 10 seconds. "No," she said. "I can't choose silence for peace. I can't let anyone leak that data, as if it's not the product of hundreds of people who worked day and night. Then prepare yourself, Charles said softly. The real battle starts here. 3 days later, leaked news from the press. A deputy director at Leon Enterprises is under investigation for data manipulation and internal espionage. No name was mentioned, but the 26th floor office, where Leon's senior operations management sat, was thoroughly inspected. Vivian knew this wasn't a victory. This began a long fight, where power, money, and trust could be weighed like merchandise. She returned to her small apartment that weekend night and took off the heavy blazer. Her phone lit up with a message from Richard. "Come to the balcony. There are stars tonight." She stepped out. That Atlanta night was a rare, clear one, stars sparkling like the connectors between past and present. A deep voice played softly from the small speaker on the table. Piano notes. An instrumental piece she'd heard Richard play when they were strangers living under the same roof, never daring to look at each other for more than 3 seconds. Vivian closed her eyes. Among the wind sweeping through the bars, among wounds not yet healed, among words too difficult to say, there was only one thing she knew for sure. She would not stop. Not because of threats, not because of empty promises, and not because of loneliness in the fight. Because from this moment on, the truth no longer knows silence, and she is its most unmistakable voice. In early December, Atlanta began to carry a deep chill that seeped into the skin. The streets wore a thin veil of silence, as if the city was quietly transitioning between doubt and awakening. The bluish-white lights inside the Leon Enterprises office still shone down on each desk as usual, but those with keen eyes would notice the atmosphere had shifted. Vivian Yetta was no longer just a project manager. She had become an unofficial symbol of transformation between the old and the new, concealment and transparency. Yet she did not want to be a symbol. She only wanted to be herself, clear enough not to be swallowed, and subtle enough not to hurt anyone walking her through this threshold of change. At the end of the day, as others gradually left the office, Vivian remained seated. Her laptop screen displayed an internal report that included a name she hadn't expected. Claire Watson, a senior coordinating assistant, once entrusted by Vivian to supervise data security in the central region. Claire was suspected of aiding unauthorized data backups, though the evidence wasn't conclusive. However, recovered security footage showed Claire opening the technical storage room after hours, precisely the night the storage device was stolen. Vivian didn't believe it. Not because she thought Claire innocent, but because she understood Claire, a single mother who had once declined a promotion to avoid shifting work hours that conflicted with picking up her daughter from daycare. A meticulous, unambitious woman who wasn't good at deceit. She needed dialogue, not interrogation. The next morning, Vivian waited for Claire in the 19th floor break area, where the building's outdated coffee machine sat untouched by most. Claire walked in, tired, with sunken eyes from many sleepless nights. "I need to talk," Vivian started, handing her a cup of hot cocoa. Claire accepted silently. "The cameras showed you opened the technical storage on the night of November 12th, Vivian said slowly. "I need to know. Why?" Claire bit her lip, gripping the cup so tightly that the heat left marks on her skin. "Someone in IT asked me to transfer a backup data copy through a secondary encryption system, said it was to check for data overlap errors before the audit. You believe that?" "He went to school with my son," Claire whispered. "I thought he just wanted a favor to speed things up. I didn't think it was the original data. I didn't know." Vivian was silent. She understood that feeling. When someone does a small thing out of trust, only to realize they've accidentally opened a loophole that can't be patched. "I'm not accusing you," Vivian said. "But if I stay silent, Someone will use you as evidence to legitimize the theft. Claire looked up, eyes glistening with tears. So, what do you want me to do? Testify. Clarify who asked you. I will protect you fairly and legally. But if you stay silent, they'll make you the scapegoat to cut off the trail. Claire nodded very slightly. That afternoon, the reaction was mild. When the news of Claire's cooperation in the investigation was internally announced. However, Richard Taylor immediately ordered all IT access to be locked down within 72 hours and formed an independent investigation team with external oversight. Vivian was appointed one of 3 strategic supervisors for the tracing process, once again, stepping deeper into the eye of the storm. That night, Richard came to Vivian's apartment. No schedule, no warning. She opened the door, surprised to see him wearing a charcoal turtleneck and a long light brown coat, hair tousled by the wind. He held a paper bag containing 2 portions of hot pasta and a bottle of white wine. I wasn't sure if I should call first, he said, his eyes softening. But I thought, maybe you need a dinner without a data and cybersecurity talk. Vivian stepped aside to let him in without a word. The small kitchen was bathed in warm yellow light, the scent of tomato sauce mingling with ginger mint from a scented candle, creating a strangely cozy atmosphere. They ate silently for a while. No awkwardness, just the calm of 2 people tired of the outside world, yet still holding a little kindness for each other. Richard spoke first. I used to think if I kept you out of the whirlwind, you'd be safer. Vivian put down her fork and looked at him. But I don't need to be kept out of the whirlwind, she said. I need to know I'm not alone when stepping into it. He was silent momentarily, then gently placed his hand on hers. So this time, don't push me away. She didn't reply. But the light squeeze was enough for him to understand. Their trust was being rebuilt. Not hurriedly, but steadily. Before leaving, Richard stood at the doorway, watching her in the hallway light. I used to think our marriage was a contract. And now? She asked. He gave a faint smile. Now I'm not sure. But if it is a contract, I want to renew it, provided you can renegotiate all the terms. Vivian smiled, but said nothing. Because she knew, in love, the most critical terms aren't in words. They lie in the way people stay when every reason to leave is present. Outside, the wind blew a last autumn leaf, spinning a few times before falling onto the stone-paved sidewalk. A circle closed. But perhaps it was a sign that a new one was about to open, between 2 people who were once strangers, once reckless, once silent beside each other, and now learning to slow down, to listen to their hearts no longer disturbed by the world around. That winter in Atlanta, there was no snowfall, but it was cold enough for people to realize they needed a hand to hold. The city still buzzed with the indifferent traffic flow, yet amidst the pale gray days approaching the new year, the lights at Leon Enterprises shone brighter than ever before. The Horizon Project officially relaunched after 3 weeks of review and restructuring. The internal investigation confirmed that those manipulating data were a group of shareholders linked to an old partner in California, with covert assistance from a senior IT staff member. Claire Watson was exonerated and promoted to regional coordinator for the Central Region with her honor intact. And Vivian Yetta, the woman who once walked into Leon under the title of a paper wife of a CEO, now stood as the primary name on the blueprint for restructuring the company's entire security system. No longer a shadow, no longer on the sidelines. On the last afternoon of the year, the office was quiet. Only small Christmas trees neatly decorated sat beside each row of desks. Vivian stood alone by the 25th floor window, the place she once dared not dream of entering. She was no longer a person merely existing in silence. She had learned to speak through actions, courage, and love forged in the fires of doubt and trial. The door behind her gently opened. Richard Taylor stepped in, carrying a small gift box wrapped in handmade paper, tied with a silver ribbon in a crooked bow. "Congratulations," he said, his voice low but eyes burning with tender fire. "For what?" She tilted her head, curious. "For teaching me how to trust, not with reason, but with the heart." Vivian smiled, but said nothing. She knew there were words that, if spoken, would be too much, and there were things that silence alone could fill. He handed her the box. Inside was a simple leather bracelet, engraved with two small words. "Still here." He said, "I'm not good at promises, but I know one thing. After everything we've been through, I only want to stay." Vivian lightly squeezed her wrist, feeling the texture of leather against skin. Not flashy, not glittering, but an indelible mark. That night, they walked together down a small path near Piedmont Park. Neither of them remembered exactly what they said. Only the quiet laughter, the cold wind stirring the dry branches, and the moment her hand slipped into his, without hesitation. Stopping beneath a street lamp, he bent to look at her, his voice soft like a late piano melody. "Vivian, if you hadn't saved my grandfather that day, do you think we would have ever met?" She looked at him, eyes deep as night but gentle as candlelight. "Probably not," she replied. "And do you regret it?" Vivian shook her head. "No, because if I had the choice again, even if it meant starting over from mopping floors or signing a fake contract, I'd still choose to enter your life. Just this time, don't turn away when I need someone by my side." Richard squeezed her hand tighter. Something melted in the howl of the wind. Not tears, but the walls that had once separated two wounded hearts. A week later, at Leon's year-end ceremony, Vivian appeared beside Richard, not as the CEO's wife, but as the strategic director of the Horizon Project, the woman who had led the company out of an unprecedented data crisis. Under the warm yellow lights, applause echoed back into the days when the brown-skinned girl silently bore her burdens to keep from breaking. And Richard, neither arrogant nor flashy, stood there, looking at her not as an heir, but as a man who had learned to love, with everything left in his heart after a life ruled by reason. At the end of the party, as guests departed one by one, Vivian remained by the last Christmas tree in the hall. Richard approached, gently draping his coat over her shoulders. "I used to think our marriage was a contract," he said. "And now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now I'm not sure. But if it is a contract, I want to renew it, on the condition that you can renegotiate every term." Vivian smiled, but didn't reply. Because she knew that in love, the most critical terms aren't found in written words, but in how people stay, when every reason to leave is present. Outside, the wind blew a final autumn leaf, spinning a few circles before landing on the stone-paved sidewalk. A circle closed, but maybe it was a sign that a new one was about to open, between two people who once were strangers, once reckless, once silent beside each other, and now learning to slow down, to listen to their hearts no longer disturbed by the world around them. If you believe that even in uncertain beginnings, love can grow strong enough to overcome the storms, don't hesitate to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel to continue journeying alongside stories that stir your heart. Once again,